Hey everybody, I'm John de Havilland, and I'm going to talk a little bit about web apps. This is a brief introduction to what web apps are, how to think about them, and some key concepts. So when we think about web apps, we're really talking about anything that involves an application that interacts over the internet. When we think about some of the largest websites in the world, and this view I think is from a few years ago, but shows there was a large number, Google being a very large one, got Facebook, YouTube, others that we're familiar with, but also there's tons and tons of other websites out there that people can interact with. If you think about pretty much most of the things you're interacting with on your mobile phone, for example, that is going over the internet and probably interacting with web apps in some way, shape, or form. So with the internet, web apps are ubiquitous everywhere, and it's critical as you're thinking about coding that you're familiar with some of the core concepts of web apps. So when we think about web apps, I think it's important to think about a couple of different things. First, when we talk about the computer, this is the device that you have that you're going to be using as the entrance point of where you're going to interact with these web apps. Now that could certainly be a computer like a laptop or a desktop, but it could also be your cell phone, which today often has network capabilities to interact with the internet. It could also be a smart device. For example, if you have a smart fridge or a smart toaster, some of those are connected to the internet too, and have the ability to interact with web apps. There is a large plethora of things that are now connected to the internet. And that leads us to the second box here, the internet. This is a broad network of computers across the globe in a distributed computing fashion that allows you to connect with hundreds and thousands of different computers that are hosting different pieces of code across the globe to provide different functionality, provide access to all sorts of data, and allow you to interact with others wherever they may sit. And typically, one of the ways you can interact with these web apps is via your web browser. And there's many different sort of technologies that are available in this space. Everything from ones you're familiar with, such as Microsoft's Edge or Google's Chrome, as well as many others like Safari. When we think about the basics of a web app, if you remember in Sprint 1, if you went through the content there, you built an app and you were able to add items or remove items from a list. But this was all done locally on your machine. There was no networking call made, and by that, no calls from your application went out from your computer to somewhere else and back again. When we think about a web app, it's really kind of thinking about interacting with a front end where you can access and start interacting with the web app. So this is typically something that's served up on your local machine. And then that's interacting to a backend, which provides a lot of the heavy lifting from a computing perspective. And that backend often interacts with various data sources to return data back to you that you're asking for. And these could also certainly all live on the same machine, but typically for web apps, these are distributed in different places. And so the front end may be hosted somewhere, the back end may be hosted somewhere else, and the data may be hosted somewhere else as well. And those arrows can represent networking between them, and networking being simply fiber between these two or three different locations that allow data to be transmitted over them, or bits and bytes to be transmitted over them, to provide you the functionality and data that you need. Now, when you go to access a web app, you often put in a name, such as bing.com. But it's interesting, when we think about that, the computer is looking for bing.com, but they actually find a unique address for that, and then return that, kind of looking up a name in a phone book, if you're familiar with the old concept of phone books. And so this is often handled through what's known as domain name services. And there's often a domain name services server somewhere that has all the records of what bing.com, for example, associated with. So they'll look at bing.com, find the unique IP address, and then connect you directly to that site. So when you're entering the name for a website, whether it's bing.com, google.com, or any other website, it's an easy to remember name to allow you to access it. But under the hood, there's a mapping to an address where it lives. And the domain name services servers have all that information to allow you to look that up. Now, when we think about web app development, I think there's two key concepts just to think about. There's the front end versus the back end, and we have to hear a lot about these. When we think about the front end, there's three core technologies that drive most of our front end development, whether this is through a web browser and a web page that you see served up, or through a mobile app. There's three technologies here that are important, and they're highlighted. We've got HTML, we've got CSS, and we've got JavaScript. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language, and this is the basics of any web page that you interact with on the web. If you view the page source in any browser, you'll be able to see the HTML tags that make up that page. And this is the basic programming language for front-end web pages. It's fairly straightforward and is been around for a long time. Then in order to style the web page, to give it its unique colors and fonts and various attractive features to make the page look better, you've got cascading style sheets. And these are descriptors of different styles that you can apply to the HTML. And so often you see HTML and cascading style sheets tied together to form a web page. But sometimes you want more interactivity and more fun features, or you want more control or more dynamic functions in your website. And for that, we turn to JavaScript. And this really ties the three pieces together nicely, because JavaScript brings the ability to do client-side programming to allow you to do more advanced features, such as having different parts of a page load at different times, do things like having loading indicators when something's taking a long time so the user knows something's happening, as well as doing things like animations and other things. JavaScript really opens the door from the power of what you can do from a web app perspective. And all of these are often sitting at the front end of your web app and displaying you the gateway into the web app that's serving up the data and functions that you need. And that's where the backend sits. That's where all of kind of the heavy lifting happens, where the logic to handle what someone's asking for happens. And that often happens on a server somewhere. And there's often an application sitting on that server that the front end is interacting with. The server could be anything. It could be hosting on your local machine and you're having the web app hosted locally. But typically that server's hosted somewhere else, and there's a number of hosting companies. Microsoft has a hosting company, if you will, through Azure, where we can host web apps of all sorts of size and shape. You may have heard of things like servers for web apps such as Apache, which have the technology to serve up web pages. And you can run those on any computing power that you have to really serve up your web pages. And then applications sit on these servers, and the applications can be coded in a number of different languages to create the web app experience that the front end is interacting with. These could be in Python, which we are working through in this workshop, but they could be in C#, they could be in Java. They could also be in JavaScript. You can write a front end and a back end, front end being JavaScript for the client side, and you can have back end JavaScript to serve up the heavy lifting from a back end perspective. And often these applications interact with some sort of data store, whether that's the database, which we'll look at in a later sprint, or they could be interacting with files and serving up images or documents or just plain data, depending on what the user is asking for. When we think about how the front end and the back end interact, typically the front end is going to make one of four common commands. As a user, you're going to come in through the front end and you're either going to make a GET request from the back end to get some data or get some information. That's back end is going to get that command, get the data or information for you, and send it back down to the front end to show you. Sometimes as a user, you want to send some data to the back end. Maybe you're filling out a form to register for a website. So you're going to send the information that you fill out on the front end to the back end. It's going to take that, process it, and create you an account. Sometimes you may want to update the information that's stored in the back end. Maybe after that registration process, you need to change your address at some point in the future. So you can send an update, and it will update that specific piece related to your information. And then the final piece is you may want to delete the information you sent to the back end at some point, or delete some piece of information from the back end. Maybe you want to delete a registration at some point in the future. So you could send a delete command with the pieces of information you want to delete, and the back end often handles that and processes that for you. There are other sorts of commands, but these are the four common commands that pretty much every interaction with a website goes through. And when we think about these, from a framework perspective, you often maybe see them referenced in this way, where you have a get command, a post command, a put command, or a delete command, corresponding to those four different actions I just described. And the four of these often form what's known as an API, or an application programming interface. An API is super important from a web app perspective because it allows you to have a front end and a back end interacting through a common interface through those typical four commands. With that, this wraps up Introduction to Web Apps. I hope you enjoyed the rest of the workshop.